this is Sonnet 29, When in Disgrace with Fortune and Men's Eyes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through what a sonnet actually is and how structurally they're put together. I'll then talk a bit about Shakespeare and sonnets because he did a lot for this type of writing, and then we'll look in a kind of bit more detail at a deep dive of the language within this particular sonnet. But this ultimately is a sonnet about the power of love and the power of positivity to change your mindset, and the idea that love offers some kind of compensation for all of the setbacks and all of the hardships in life, and that's the main gist of this sonnet. But we'll come back to that all a little bit later. So what is a sonnet? So ultimately a sonnet is a poem, and it always comes in the form of 14 lines. And sonnet literally means little song. And these poems would always have a fixed rhyme scheme, so the rhymes would be very specific within the poem. And they usually end with a rhyming couplet or a heroic couplet, so the last two lines will always rhyme. Traditionally, they're also written in iambic pentameter, which is, of course, the kind of unstressed, stressed syllable we're very used to seeing in Shakespeare. Sounds a lot like a heartbeat, that da-dum, da-dum, da-dum kind of rhythm, meaning that sonnets were always kind of associated with the idea of love, with the iambic pentameter linking, of course, to the heartbeat and to honesty and all those kind of ideas. Also, traditionally, sonnets would come in what was known as the Italian sonnet form, and the Italian sonnet would have the first 8 lines would be an octane, so that's a kind of poem with its own little kind of theme, and then the last 6 lines would then be a sextet, so it would come in almost 2 halves with a volta, that turning point after the first 8 lines, and that was always called the Italian sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet. And at the time, that was the very traditional way of writing it. However, Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, and in that time, he created his own way of writing them, and he kind of changed it up a bit. And he made the sonnets so that instead of having a kind of 8 and 6 form, they were in 3 quatrains. So the first 12 lines would be kind of 3 sets of 4 lines. They'd have a A, B, A, C, D, C kind of rhyme scheme, and then he would end in that heroic couplet at the end. So he actually very much changed the structure in which the sonnets take their form, and this Sonnet 29 lies with that traditional form, which is now called the Shakespearean sonnet or the English sonnet. So he did so much for the form of the sonnet that we actually named that style after him now. So you can see in Sonnet 29 it's got those first 4 lines, then the next 4, then the next 4, those 3 quatrains in terms of rhyme, and then that final couplet at the end, and he's quite kind of strict within that format. Shakespeare's relationship with sonnets were, as we know, he kind of created that structure for them. He also used them in a lot of his plays. They appear in Much Ado About Nothing, they appear in Henry V. Romeo and Juliet, they're prolific. One of his main plays about love, the prologue takes the form of a sonnet. When Romeo and Juliet first meet each other, they speak in like a sonnet form, using those quatrains to build up the instant kind of relationship of love that they have. So he is incredibly fond of using them. He only wrote 3 sonnets that don't stick to this traditional scheme, which was Sonnet 99, 126 and 145, because they had slightly different line lengths, but all the rest follow this format. Sonnets were especially popular at the time for many reasons. People liked them, of course, as they were kind of lovely, quick love notes you could almost leave, and you would employ someone to write a sonnet for your loved one. But people also liked them because they could be quite poetically subtle. So instead of being very explicit, you could be a bit more playful and poetic while actually wanting to be quite explicit. So they were quite fun for that reason as well. So that's why they were popular at the time. So let's look in a bit more detail at the language of this specific sonnet. So Sonnet 29 is a very interesting sonnet. Traditionally, we know they are always linked to love, and often they're linked to quite superficial views of love, the idea of kind of image and the idea of beauty, and a lot of them are linked to aesthetic. Whereas this sonnet doesn't. It's much more about the deeper idea of love and the kind of philosophy of love and the way that love sits in life as well. And the other strange thing about this sonnet is that actually the language it's using is quite negative, especially for the first 8 lines of this sonnet. So we start off, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I alone beweep my outcast state. He's basically saying, when I'm sitting on my own in the state of self-pity, and he sort of talks about these ideas of beweeping and being outcast, so he's being shunned by society and feels sorry for himself, which isn't a traditional way to start a love poem. It's quite strange. And then he segues into, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. And this is bold. He calls heaven deaf. And he basically says that he believes God and heaven are ignoring his self-pitying pleas. And this was a very religious time. Of course, Shakespeare was living through the kind of continuous battling between the Protestants and the Catholics within the country. In his lifetime, he wrote for 2 separate monarchs who had 2 different religious ideals. So God was an incredibly important image for people of this time. And to turn around openly within the first 4 lines and say that God is deaf and God doesn't want to hear your problems is quite brave of him to say. And he says that he's making bootless cries. His cries are useless, and he feels that there is no kind of, that there's nobody listening to these self-pitying cries. So he doesn't create a character in this sonnet that we like necessarily. He doesn't create someone that we want to succeed in love, which is quite strange. It's an interesting approach that he takes. And we don't know to this day whether Shakespeare was writing, although it's written in the first person, we don't know whether he's writing it as himself or if he is taking on some kind of character, or perhaps referencing this is how he thinks a large number of people think. We aren't sure. But he basically says, I look upon myself and curse my fate. And again, this idea of fate and love often go hand in hand, especially in plays like Romeo and Juliet. We see fate cropping up all the time. And to sit there and say, I curse my fate, the path that God has planned for me is wrong, is again bold and quite a strange thing to say within a love poem. He's sort of saying he thinks that man knows better than God, which is interesting. But as we come through the poem, we see the kind of religious connotations change slightly. So we'll come on to those in due course. And then he says, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. So we've had this first quatrain where he is quite self-pitying and accusing of God, and then we get into the second quatrain where he starts to really show this theme of jealousy. We've gone from despair, which is again not very linking to love, and now we come into jealousy, which again is very far removed from love. And he doesn't even seem like he's just jealous of one person. He says, this man's art and that man's scope. He's jealous of lots of people. And jealousy, of course, is directly linked to the idea of sin. It's one of the 7 deadly sins, coming in the form of envy. So it's a very strange way to bring this idea of love into a poem. And that's what makes this sonnet so interesting. It's not your traditional love sonnet at all. We haven't really focused on the superficial qualities of beauty and aesthetic. We're looking at far deeper emotions, and we're going to see how he kind of ties these ideas into love. And he ends that second quatrain with what I most enjoy contented least. He's saying the things I love the most to do actually bring me the least amount of happiness. So we're in quite a depressing place, and this is where we arrive at that volta, which is that turning point of the poem. So although we've had these 2 quatrains, those first 8 lines, this is now our turning point. So we've had the despair, we've had the jealousy, we're set up for quite a strange idea of love in this poem, but now we bring in this turning point. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despairing, haply I think on thee. So he's saying, however, when I have these moments of despair and I feel jealous and I feel like all is lost, I think about you, and that changes. So here is, with this turning point, we start to bring the love into this poem. And this is where we bring in that idea, that kind of almost philosophical thought that love in our life makes up for all those feelings of despair and all those feelings of jealousy, all those setbacks and hardships. Love kind of makes them all okay because we have the ability still to love each other. And then we bring in this lovely bird imagery. So then he brings in, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. So now, and this part is bracketed as well, which is interesting. It makes it seem almost like an afterthought, which could say quite a few different things. But he brings in this idea of like to the lark at break of day arising. And bird imagery is a popular idea in Shakespeare. In Macbeth, he uses bird imagery a lot. It's kind of this idea of innocence and beauty and quite heavenly. The dove as a symbol of kind of heaven has always stood within the kind of Catholic ideal. So it's very much of bringing back that religious imagery in a somewhat more subtle way, and the idea that love is like a bird. It's free, it can fly away and leave you and then come back to you, but also it's quite fragile, and perhaps it doesn't have that kind of sustaining ability within life as maybe other emotions like jealousy or despair do as well. But it's interesting how he says sings hymns at heaven's gate, and he's playing now with the idea of heaven being this state that we all want to achieve, and these larks, these birds, are able to sing at heaven's gates, and it's like God is listening to the bird of love. So although God won't listen to your cries of despair, that's not what he's interested in, but he will listen to you professing love and to you involving yourself in love, because that's what will make you a good person and more likely to get to heaven. So although he started off with these quite bold and brave accusing ideas of religion, he's actually kind of tying it all back together and bringing it back round to those Catholic or even Protestant values of love but both, although different religions, they both had the same kind of ideals. So, but that's a whole other deep dive for a whole other day. And then he ends the sonnet with that kind of rhyming couplet. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. And he's ultimately saying his message is that when he has the love of this person, and he never says who this person is, it could be a person of any gender, any age, we don't know. It's not necessarily romantic love, it could be platonic love, parental love, it could be anything. We don't know the love in which he's talking about, but he's ultimately saying that love is more valuable than the state of kings, so kings have land, money, power. He's saying none of that matters. What matters is whether or not you have love. And that's the ultimate message of the poem. However, throughout there is a link between love and wealth. And you could look at that in two ways. The idea that love makes you rich and makes you wealthy, which is a very positive way to look at it. But then you could also look at it at the idea of love having some kind of worth and some kind of value, and that love is interchangeable like wealth as well. So that there are positive and negative connotations. Shakespeare never likes to give us a clear answer to things, so it's always nice to think about the different ways in which he might mean something. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about, which I think is really quite interesting about this poem, is that the punctuation he uses is quite fascinating in that there is no full stop until the end of the poem. Technically, this whole poem is one sentence. Although we do have caesura, breaking it up with these kind of commas, we've got semicolons, he uses those brackets when he brings in that bird imagery, like this kind of additional thought he puts into the poem. But what's interesting is by having it be one sentence, it's almost like it symbolises this idea of love throughout life and how love is constantly there, and even though life is going on, this poem is moving, the love kind of underpins the whole thing. And it might be his way of kind of saying that you have to sit through these hardships, these moments of despair, the moments of jealousy, the moments that maybe make us sinful or make us bad people. You have to sit through those and live through those in order to then feel the benefit of love and to see why love is such a great and important thing. There's a little breakdown of Sonnet 29. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet, in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.